I bribed my doctor to declare me functionally deceased, and I had my wife hide a tiny communication device under my hospital blanket. Why? Because I knew the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from your own blood. And I was about to catch my son red-handed trying to steal my life's work. My name is Robert. I'm 70 years old, and for 40 of those years, I built a small but incredibly profitable manufacturing company from the ground up. It was my legacy, my pride, and the only thing my son, Mark, and his wife, Sarah, ever truly cared about. They weren't interested in the long hours, the grit, or the hard work. They were only interested in the liquidation value. They'd been circling like vultures, waiting for the day I'd finally kick the bucket so they could sell it off and splurge the money on fancy cars and cruises. They never hid their impatience well. I saw the calculation in their eyes every time I coughed a little too hard. If you've ever had to deal with the sickening realization that family can be your worst enemy, you know this feeling. The story only gets darker from here, so if you want to follow the absolute depths of this betrayal and witness the revenge I spent months planning, make sure you hit that subscribe button now. It's a story you won't want to miss. For years, I'd run the company almost entirely on my own, partially because I loved the work, but mostly because Mark was a vacuum of ambition. He'd show up late, shuffle papers, and generally contribute nothing but passive aggression. Sarah was worse, a high-maintenance parasite who viewed the company, which provided salaries for dozens of hard-working people, as nothing more than a giant cache waiting to be unlocked. I tried to retire 3 years ago, offering Mark the reins, but he flat out refused, saying, "Why run a business when I can just inherit the check?" That was the moment the planning started. I began restructuring the company's bylaws and setting up specific complex triggers in the operating agreement that would only activate if certain conditions were met, conditions related to fraud or malfeasance. Call it insurance. I knew they were plotting, but I needed undeniable concrete proof that would stand up in court. The thought of using my own mortality as bait was nauseating. It felt morally bankrupt, but they left me no choice. I was 70, and every day I watched them, I felt my legacy slipping away, not just to death, but to their sheer, calculated greed. This company was my life. It wasn't just money. It represented the life savings and retirement of all my employees. Letting Mark sell it was not an option. I needed a situation that would force them to act immediately and openly, without any pretense. I needed to remove myself from the picture entirely, to become a dead asset in their eyes. Little did they know, I was about to become the most dangerous dead asset they would ever encounter. The stage was set, and all I needed was an opportunity, an incident that would render me conveniently helpless. The opportunity I needed, the accident, came 2 weeks later. It wasn't planned, but when fate hands you the perfect cover, you take it. I was checking a leaky pipe in the dim old basement. I missed the last step on the wooden staircase, and I went down hard. I didn't break my neck, but the back of my head slammed against the concrete floor. The sirens and the ambulance ride were a distant, jarring noise, but the moment I woke up in the emergency room, staring at the ceiling, the pain was secondary to the realization this was my chance. I saw Evelyn standing over me, her face pale with worry. I squeezed her hand, our pre-agreed signal that my mind was fully conscious and that I was thinking clearly. I had to use this. The attending physician was Dr. Hughes, a sharp young man who owed me a substantial, long-standing debt of gratitude. I'd financially supported him through his most difficult year in medical school and more recently helped him navigate a minor professional crisis. When Evelyn stepped out, I used a barely perceptible muscle movement in my mouth. "Code red, Hughes," I whispered, the words barely audible. He blinked once, the professional detachment in his eyes replaced by fierce recognition. The plan we had meticulously and grimly rehearsed months ago was now active. The plan was audacious and hinged entirely on his performance. Dr. Hughes was to diagnose me with a severe form of temporary locked-in syndrome, a terrifying condition where the mind is fully aware and conscious, but the body is completely paralyzed and unable to communicate. He had to make it utterly convincing. He ran the necessary tests, but he subtly manipulated the official reporting and his tone, suggesting I was barely clinging to life. He had to sell the lie that I couldn't move, couldn't speak, and most importantly, couldn't communicate or intervene in the company's affairs. He was risking his career for me, but he knew what Mark and Sarah were capable of. He returned minutes later with Evelyn, his voice gravely serious. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "your husband is stable, but he's currently unresponsive. It's a very severe state. We don't know when or if he will recover motor function." Evelyn, a brilliant actress, dissolved into tears, playing the role of the distraught wife perfectly. Lying there, unable to even twitch an eyebrow or blink normally, was the most terrifying, isolating experience of my life. Every primal instinct screamed at me to sit up, to tell Evelyn I was fine, to just move a finger. But the stakes were too high. I had to let them believe the worst. I was betting my company, my legacy, and potentially my remaining years of freedom on Mark and Sarah's insatiable hunger for money. I knew they would act fast now that the obstacle, me, was supposedly out of the way. I was confined to silence, waiting for the vultures to arrive. The fee? Silence was the worst kind of scream. I was completely aware, a prisoner inside my own head. I could hear the hospital's rhythmic beeps, the squeak of nurses' shoes, and the soft, heartbroken breathing of my wife, Evelyn. My mind was running 100 miles an hour, processing every detail, every sound. But my body was a concrete shell. It's the ultimate feeling of psychological powerlessness, and I had chosen it. I had to focus on the one thing that connected me to the world, the system I had engineered with Evelyn. Before the accident, we had meticulously prepared our hidden communication system. It was ridiculously simple, designed to circumvent any potential digital surveillance or medical monitoring. It was a tiny, custom-made pressure-sensitive button, no bigger than a tic-tac, wired to a low-frequency radio transmitter. Evelyn had carefully taped it to the palm of my left hand, just under the thumb, and concealed it completely beneath the large hospital gauze they wrapped me in after the fall. The battery life was long, and the receiver, which looked like a simple, elegant wrist alarm, was always on Evelyn's wrist. Activating it required an infinitesimal movement, a subtle, sustained contraction of the muscle at the base of my thumb. We had practiced the sequences for weeks while I was still healthy, teaching my thumb to move in isolation from the rest of my hand. A single short pulse meant, "I am aware, proceed." 2 pulses meant, "Danger, abort." But the long 3-second pulse, that was the crucial one. It meant, "It's them. Initiate the legal trap." The sheer effort required to produce that tiny, deliberate twitch while maintaining perfect, motionless stillness was physically and mentally exhausting. I was terrified that if I tried to activate it now, I might set off a tremor or a twitch that would betray the whole charade to the nurses, but I knew I had to be ready. I must have been lying there for about 36 hours when I heard the first sign of the inevitable. Evelyn was dozing in the uncomfortable chair beside me when her phone buzzed softly. I couldn't see the screen, but I heard the tone, the one reserved exclusively for Mark, our son. Evelyn's posture instantly shifted from grief-stricken wife to focused strategist. She slipped out into the hallway, leaving the door ajar just enough for me to hear snippets of her hushed conversation. "Yes, the prognosis is grim," I heard her say, her voice thick with the performance of fake grief. "I understand the urgency, but now? Really, Mark?" Urgency, that was the key word. They were moving faster than I anticipated. The game had begun, and the vultures were coming to collect their prematurely acquired fortune. I prepared my thumb for the longest, most important twitch of my life. They arrived 12 hours later, sweeping into my sterile, quiet room like a low-budget corporate takeover team. Mark, my son, looked perfectly rehearsed in a dark, expensive suit, though his tie looked slightly crooked. Sarah, his wife, had a forced expression of sorrow on her face that couldn't quite hide the glittering, almost giddy excitement in her eyes. And with them was a man I didn't recognize, a sharp-featured lawyer carrying a heavy black briefcase. This was not a condolence visit. This was a hostile acquisition attempt. Evelyn was sitting quietly beside me, holding my hand. Mark gave her a stiff, purely performative hug. "Mother, you need to be strong," he said, his voice dripping with false empathy that made my stomach churn. Then, without even bothering to look at me, their supposedly comatose father, he immediately turned to the lawyer. "Mr. Peterson, can we review the preliminary documents? Time is of the essence. We need to finalize the temporary transfer of authority before the end of the fiscal quarter." Lying there, unable to move a single muscle, I felt a tidal wave of icy rage wash over me. My son, my own flesh and blood, was talking about seizing control of my life's work while I was technically still breathing, right here in the room. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to sit up and physically throw them out of the hospital. But I couldn't. I was trapped in my body, forced to listen to them carve up my legacy. The feeling of being completely stripped of autonomy was worse than any pain from the fall. The lawyer, Peterson, clicked open his briefcase. "Mark, we need Mrs. Miller to confirm a few details regarding the power of attorney, but yes, the papers are ready. Since Mr. Miller is medically incapacitated, we can move very quickly." Sarah then walked over to my bedside table, picking up a vase of flowers Evelyn had brought. She lowered her voice, but not enough. The cynicism in her tone cut through the air. "Honestly, Mark, the quicker this is done, the better," she whispered. "The company's market value is only going to depreciate if we wait for him to recover. He's a dead asset right now. We need to liquidate." Dead asset. That term hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just plotting a sale, they were treating me like a piece of outdated machinery ready for the scrap heap. It was the confirmation I desperately needed. They weren't just opportunistic, they were truly vicious. Now, the real performance was about to begin. They felt safe enough to discuss the finer details of the betrayal. I just had to hold still and listen. Evelyn, performing the part of the distraught wife perfectly, strategically moved toward the window, giving Mark, Sarah, and the lawyer Peterson the privacy they clearly wanted. They took the bait immediately. They lowered their voices, but not enough for me to miss the crucial details. I had to be absolutely still, straining every nerve to process the betrayal. Mark was explaining the deal to Peterson. They had secured a preliminary offer from a company named Genesis Acquisitions. "It's a rush job," Mark said, his voice laced with smug satisfaction. "They're offering $12 million. Dad consistently valued the company at closer to 20, but since we're selling it as an immediate liquidation, they're taking advantage of the distress sale." The $12 million figure wasn't just low, it was criminally insulting. My company, with its secured contracts and high-grade machinery, was worth every cent of $20 million, probably more. This confirmed my deepest suspicion. They weren't just selling it. They were selling it quickly and cheaply to a specific buyer, likely to pocket a massive, under-the-table kickback or a bribe, cutting out all proper valuation and fiduciary duties. This wasn't just stealing from me. This was a direct threat to the pensions and financial futures of the dozens of people who had worked loyally beside me for decades. The real cruelty came next, delivered with casual contempt by Sarah. "Honestly, Mark, who cares about the final price? The quicker we get rid of that dusty old factory and Dad's ridiculously sentimental, outdated values, the better," she hissed. "Remember how he used to lecture us about integrity and hard work? Thank God that lecturing is finally over." She laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound that felt like sandpaper rubbing against my exposed nerves. They mocked the very foundations I had built my life on. My body was screaming in protest, but I couldn't move. I felt the tiny pressure button beneath my thumb, my only lifeline, but I hadn't seen the clear, all-safe signal from Evelyn yet. I had to wait until she was in position. I focused every ounce of my will on contracting that tiny muscle just to give her the urgent alert, but the adrenaline and pure shock caused my entire arm to freeze up in a spasm of tension. I couldn't risk a visible twitch. I was paralyzed by my own trap, forced to lie there and listen to them celebrate the destruction of my life inches from my head. I needed Evelyn to make her move. Evelyn was giving the performance of a lifetime. She sniffled quietly, wiping away a tear, but her eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a fierce, controlled focus. Mark and Sarah completely dismissed her presence. They saw her as emotionally compromised, too fragile and heartbroken to be a threat, exactly what we had anticipated. Mark patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Mother, don't worry about any of this technical stuff. Sarah and I will handle it. Just go home and rest. You look exhausted." They saw her grief as a weakness, which was the perfect cover for her strength. I can't leave him," she stammered, pulling a shawl tightly around her shoulders. "It smells so clinical in here. I just want to leave him something familiar." She then walked over to the small bedside table, where their attention was focused on the stacks of legal documents. She picked up the large, heavy photo frame of us from our 50th wedding anniversary. It was a picture Mark had always hated because he wasn't in it. As she placed the frame back, down, she used its shadow and her shawl to conceal her quick, precise movements. Attached to the back of the frame, hidden by the easel stand and positioned directly towards their discussion, was a high-sensitivity, voice-activated recorder. The subtle, almost inaudible click of its activation was swallowed by the hospital's steady ventilation hum. But in the silence of my mind, I heard it clearly. The evidence collection was underway. Mark and Sarah, completely oblivious, just continued their greedy discussion. Mark even rolled his eyes behind Evelyn's back, whispering to the lawyer, Peterson, "See? Too emotional. This is why we need to expedite the process before she starts calling psychics or something equally ridiculous." Their arrogance was breathtaking. They felt entirely safe and unopposed. The focus of their conversation shifted to the liquidation details. They were talking about the legal loopholes they planned to exploit to ensure the employees' retirement funds were restructured to cover closing costs, which was clearly a criminal euphemism for skimming the pensions. Every word they spoke was gold for our case. Evelyn lingered for another painful 5 minutes, allowing the device to capture more damning dialogue. Then she stood up abruptly, drawing a deep, shuddering breath. "I need some air. I can't breathe in here." Mark didn't object. He was too busy discussing how to hide the paper trail. This was Evelyn's window to leave and contact our own lawyer. As she passed by my bed, her hand lightly brushed the gauze on my left palm. It was a fleeting, feather-light touch, the signal that the recorder was active and she was leaving the room. Now was the time for my message. With Evelyn safely out of the room, Mark and Sarah relaxed completely, believing they had successfully cleared the main emotional obstacle. Peterson, the lawyer, immediately laid out the most critical documents on the small tray table near my head. "The temporary power of attorney documents are ready, Mark," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "We need them signed immediately to initiate the distress sale. Your mother has primary right, but if she can't fulfill the duty due to her emotional distress, which is clearly the case, you step in as the next executor." They were confident they had maneuvered Evelyn out of the way, believing her grief was genuine and incapacitating. I heard Mark instructing Peterson to prepare the necessary forms to bypass her entirely and assume control himself. This was the absolute point of no return. Evelyn was already out of the room on her way to contact our own trusted lawyer, Steve, but she needed the final unambiguous confirmation from me that the betrayal was concrete and the legal counterattack could officially begin. She was waiting for the initiate the trap signal. I focused every remaining fragment of my physical and mental strength on my left thumb. I had to contract that tiny muscle for 3 full, agonizing seconds, no more, no less. It felt like trying to lift a heavy weight with a single fragile thread. My arm was trembling internally from the effort, but I couldn't allow any external movement that would alert the vultures standing just inches away. 1. The pressure on the tic-tac-sized button was sustained. I could feel the microscopic give of the contact point. 2. I heard Sarah impatiently complaining about the quality of the hospital coffee and the delay. 3. I released the pressure cleanly and immediately went back to absolute stillness. It was the longest 3 seconds of my life, a terrifying gamble on a mechanical impulse. My mind screamed the code word, traitor. I lay back, utterly exhausted, my heart hammering against my ribs. Did the signal go through? Did the invisible radio wave successfully reach Evelyn's wrist receiver? Mark and Sarah didn't react. They were too engrossed in the financial paperwork. I felt a cold wave of fear mixed with relief. I had just risked my life's work, my legacy, and the future of my employees on a tiny hidden button and 3 seconds of muscle control. Now, the ball was in Evelyn's court. All I could do was wait for the trap to spring. About 30 minutes after I sent the 3-second pulse, Evelyn re-entered the room. She was noticeably calmer, but her movements were precise and purposeful. I noticed the tiny, immediate glance she shot at the gauze-covered hand, a quick confirmation that the signal had been received. The heavy tension in my chest eased. The operation was still on track. Peterson, the lawyer, immediately seized on her return, pushing the temporary power of attorney documents towards her. "Mrs. Miller, we need your signature here to confirm Mark can manage the interim assets. We just need to formalize the process, given your understandable distress." The pen was offered, and I held my breath, unable to move a muscle. If she signed, everything was lost. Evelyn didn't even pick up the pen. She recoiled dramatically, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with carefully controlled sobs. I can't look at these numbers right now. It feels wrong," she stammered, not facing them. "Robert just fell into a coma, and you want me to sign away his entire life? Give me until tomorrow morning. Please. I need to consult with my own conscience. I need to be sure." It was a brilliant stalling maneuver. It appealed to the lawyer's professional need for a clean, emotionally validated process. And it bought us crucial time. Mark was furious, his face turning an unhealthy shade of red, but he tried to hide it under a veneer of patience. "Mother, this is business. We are protecting Dad's assets. Stop being so dramatic." Sarah quickly intervened, trying to salvage the situation and maintain the facade of concern. "Mark, don't pressure her. We understand, Evelyn. Just a few more hours, Mark. What could possibly go wrong in a few hours?" Their confidence was staggering. They had no idea that their entire conspiracy was currently being meticulously recorded by a device on the bedside table next to them. Evelyn left the room again soon after, claiming she needed to speak to the hospital priest for comfort. In reality, she was in a hushed meeting in the hospital chapel with our corporate lawyer, Steve. The long pulse I sent confirmed the level of betrayal, and the audio recording sealed their fate. Evelyn handed Steve the device and the instructions. "They're selling it cheap, Steve. Mark is colluding with the buyer, Genesis Acquisitions. Use the fraud clauses Robert set up in the corporate bylaws. We need an emergency injunction filed by tomorrow morning. And tell Dr. Hughes we are proceeding with the final stage." Lying there waiting, I felt a quiet, powerful surge of hope. The trap was fully set, the evidence was collected, and the counterstrike was imminent. The time for lying still was almost over. The next morning, I was gone from the hospital. With Dr. Hughes's careful orchestration and a hefty final bonus, I was officially declared stable enough to be moved to a long-term care facility. Instead, Evelyn and Hughes snuck me out through the service entrance. Walking again felt alien and unstable, like I was moving someone else's legs. But the pure adrenaline fueled me. We drove straight to the downtown law offices where Mark, Sarah, and the buyers, Genesis Acquisitions, were waiting to sign the final papers. I stood outside the large oak conference room door. Through the thin glass, I could see them. Mark was beaming, signing documents, shaking hands with the buyer's CEO. He looked exactly like the proud owner of a stolen fortune. Sarah was already sipping champagne. They were celebrating their premature victory, unaware that the central figure in their betrayal, the dead asset, was standing 10 feet away, fully awake. Evelyn gave me a quick, tight hug. "Showtime, Robert," she whispered, her eyes shining with anticipation. Steve, our corporate lawyer, nodded sharply. Dr. Hughes positioned himself discreetly near the entrance, ready to confirm my legal status. I took a deep breath, straightened my tired suit jacket, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. Champagne glasses froze midair. Mark looked up, and the look on his face was not shock. It was pure, visceral terror. He saw a ghost. Sarah choked on her champagne. I cleared my throat, the sound rough and unused from days of silence. "Mark," I said, my voice dangerously steady, "were you looking for me?" The color drained instantly from his face. Before he could stammer a lie, our lawyer, Steve, stepped into the room, holding the familiar photo frame. "Gentlemen, ladies," Steve announced to the stunned participants, "Mr. Robert Miller is, in fact, present and fully capable. And as his legal counsel, I must present this evidence before any further fraudulent actions are taken." Steve placed the photo frame and a small external speaker on the table. He pressed play. The room filled with Sarah's sneering, cold voice. "He's a dead asset right now. We need to liquidate." Followed by Mark's dismissive tone. "We need to expedite the process before she starts calling psychics or something equally ridiculous." The voice of the Genesis Acquisitions CEO then joined in, confirming the illegal kickback deal. The buyer's lawyer started scrambling for his phone, realizing they were implicated in corporate fraud. Mark, now utterly panicked, lunged for the photo frame to smash the recorder, but I stepped in front of him. "I heard every word, Mark," I said, leaning in close so only he could hear the full weight of my anger. "You tried to steal my life, my employees' futures, and my legacy. Now you lose your inheritance, your place in this company, and you face a substantial civil suit for fraud." The expression of utter, absolute defeat on their faces was the sweetest, most satisfying victory I could ever have imagined. The trap had closed. Mark and Sarah were completely finished. The humiliation was total and immediate. Our lawyer, Steve, immediately filed the emergency injunction and presented the audio evidence as irrefutable proof of their malicious intent to defraud. They didn't just lose their entire inheritance, they faced a devastating multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit for attempted corporate fraud. The buyers, Genesis Acquisitions, quickly backed out, desperately trying to distance themselves from the scandal. They learned a harsh lesson: never try to steal from the dead. Mark and Sarah disappeared from our lives entirely, sinking into the legal and financial fallout they so richly deserved. Once the legal dust settled, Evelyn and I took our time. We sold the company, but we did it the right way, at its true market value of over $20 million, to a respectable, stable firm that promised to keep my employees on. I made sure every single long-term employee received a substantial, well-deserved bonus from the sale. That, securing their future, was my true legacy. Evelyn and I didn't need the massive influx of cash. We put a large portion into a new foundation focused on ethical business practices, and for the first time in 50 years, we truly retired. We bought a small, beautiful cottage by the sea and started planning the long, luxurious trips we had always postponed for the sake of the business. We finally had peace, prosperity, and the clear knowledge that our core family unit was solid. We survived the ultimate betrayal stronger, wiser, and immensely richer in spirit. Looking back, faking my coma was the hardest, scariest thing I ever did. But it was absolutely necessary. It wasn't just about the money. It was about exposing the rotten core of greed that Mark and Sarah had hidden beneath their smiles. It showed me the immense, unwavering loyalty of my true partner, Evelyn. I got my life back, and I secured my legacy. But the final question is for you. Did I do the right thing by putting my own son through this elaborate trap? What would you have done in my place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more dramatic true stories of revenge and betrayal, make sure you hit the like button on this video, drop a comment with your opinion, and most importantly, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. The end. Thank you for listening.